Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you are able to join us, whether it's the afternoon or the morning still for some of you. We're so glad that you're here to join us and learn about leveraging tax policy to help young children and their families. I am Michelle Adkins from the Prenatal-to-Three Capacity-Building Hub. We are hosting this tremendous panel today, and we're so happy that you are going to be with us to hear about these great stories about how these states are working through working on getting these policies passed and beginning to implement them. So thank you so much for being with us. I am going to now briefly go over the agenda. If I can find there we go. Oh, it's not. Okay. It's not moving forward. That's very weird.
If you're not going to use it, you got to clean it before it starts to moan.
So anyway, I'm going to, oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. So the agenda for today is the welcome, which is now. I'm going to do some brief introductions of our panel. I'm then going to hand it over to Cynthia to facilitate the panel and to have our great discussants talk about what they've been doing. And we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. If you have a burning question that is preventing you from focusing on what's happening moving forward in the webinar, then please sort of put it in the chat and I will try to get that into the conversation for you. And then we'll close out. So very glad that you are here with us. And let's get on to introducing our panel. We're very fortunate today to have with us Cynthia Osborne. She's the professor of early childhood education and policy in the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organizations at Vanderbilt University at their Peabody College. She's the founder and executive director of, I'm sure what many of you are familiar with the Prenatal-to-3 Policy Impact Center, where they take academic research and translate the science of child development into state policy levels that are the most effective to help guide states in the policies that they move forward. She's a 2023 Aspen Institute Ascend Fellow and has co-authored what I'm sure many of you have seen nationally published white papers and reports. She holds multiple degrees from a number of different very prestigious universities in demography and public affairs, public policy, and education. So thank you, Cynthia, for being with us and welcome. Next, we have Brian Burroughs. He comes to us from South Carolina. He's with the Institute for Child Success. He came to the Institute from the United States Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, where he worked as an investigative counsel. Before law school, Brian worked for several youth-serving organizations, including an elementary school district, the Girl Scouts, and Mental Health America. Brian has a bachelor's degree in psychology and later obtained a Juris Doctor and a Master of Public Policy. So welcome, Brian. We're glad you can be with us today. Next, we have Phil Falvo. He's the Public Policy Director with the United Way of Pennsylvania. And he is an experienced public policy professional with over 11 years of state government experience. During his tenure with the Pennsylvania General Assembly, Phil worked on a variety of policy areas with a primary focus on health, human services, and insurance. Phil has a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science and a Master of Public Administration. Thanks for being here, Phil. Welcome. Next, we have Ann Coonan from Michigan. She is the Kids Count Policy Director at the Michigan League for Public Policy. And there she focuses her work on early childhood, family economic security, and youth voice. Prior to her work with Kids Count at the League, she was a tax policy analyst, where her research focused on policies to make Michigan's tax code more equitable for workers, families, and communities. Ann holds a Bachelor of Arts, a Master's degree of Science and Education, and a Master's degree in Public Affairs, where she concentrated in economics and public policy. Welcome, Ann. We're glad that you are here with us today. So now that I have introduced you to our fabulous panel, I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia and let her lead the way for our conversation today.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to hear from our panelists. And before we get to them, I'm just going to share a few background slides as kind of to level set about what we're really talking about today when we're talking about tax policy and specifically tax credits. Let me make sure that we can all see my slide. So to be clear about the fact that tax policy comes in all shapes and sizes, we just put out a recent blog that really illustrated how different states' tax policies, from income tax policies to tax credits, can really make it the variation in terms of what families either owe or get in as a refund can be huge across this country. And they can make a huge difference in the resources that families have available to them. And in this particular session, we're going to talk primarily about tax credits. And tax credits are a type of tax policy that reduces the taxes that you owe, or the tax burden, by the amount of that credit. And if the credit is larger than the amount of taxes that you owe, then you may be eligible for a refund if that tax credit is refundable. So we're going to talk about the difference between refundable and non-refundable and the different types of tax credits. The two that we're going to focus on mostly today are the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. There are other types of tax credits out there. Specifically for our audiences, there are states that have a child care and dependent tax credit that's very relevant, but we're going to focus on the EITC and the CTC today. Both of these have a federal credit, and then there are many states that have their own version of the EITC or CTC. The difference between the two is that the EITC is targeted toward parents. There is an option for those who don't have children, but primarily they're targeted toward parents who are working. And for the child tax credit, it's targeted exclusively toward parents, but it's unconditional. You don't have to be working in order to receive the credit. At the federal level, both of these are refundable. So let's talk about the state's earned income tax credits for a minute. First, I want to share with you why this is such an important part of our state policy roadmap when we're thinking about how states can create a system of support for families and their children, that having access to resources, financial resources, is one of the most important things that we can provide for families. And a state earned income tax credit that's at least 10% of the federal credit and is refundable. Those two things are important. The evidence is clear that it is one of the most pro-work policies that we have. It increases maternal employment. It also adds resources into the household in terms of higher wages, reduces child poverty. And there is evidence that it also has an impact on birth outcomes by increasing birth weights, and particularly among Black babies. So the evidence is so strong of the earned income tax credit across the life course, but particularly for families with infants and toddlers, and what the state earned income tax credit does. And there are currently 32 states that have a state version of the earned income tax credit. Of those 32, there are 4 in which the credit is not refundable, and we'll talk about why that matters. And there are 28, therefore, in which it's refundable. of states that don't have a state earned income tax credit, it's very common. Those are the states most likely not to have an earned income tax credit. But Washington State kind of said, well, hold on, we can do this anyway. And they figured out how to do a working family tax credit, even though they don't have a state income tax. When it comes to policy considerations, we have a policy checklist that I'm sure we can are sharing with you in the chat, but it walks through the different sort of choices or levers that states have to consider when implementing an earned income tax credit in particular, but also for other types of tax credits. But from how much families are going to receive, whether it's going to be refundable or not refundable. If it's refundable, it helps those with the lowest levels of income. If it's not refundable, it helps those with higher levels of income. Who is actually eligible to claim this? There are states that expand eligibility beyond what the federal eligibility means to families that don't have a Social Security number, for instance, to families with younger adults, to non-custodial parents, like in New York. And then how it's paid for and whether there is a return on that investment. So these are the kind of different sorts of options. And if you look across the country right now, the variation in what states are actually doing with regard to their earned income tax credit is pretty vast. You can see in DC, a family is eligible for an additional 70% of the federal earned income tax credit. And the federal earned income tax credit can be up to $5,000 or close to $5,000 for one child at some income level. So this is a really big addition. More commonly is somewhere between 10 and 20% of the federal credit. And then there are a handful of states that have a refundable credit, but it is a very small amount. And some of those states are actually increasing that value, which is great, Montana in particular. But then you also see that of those that have a non-refundable credit, there's wide variation there from South Carolina that is giving 125% of the federal tax credit to Missouri that's giving only 10%. But the number of families that get a non-refundable credit is quite small, and the income range is very small. And then you can see the states that have no state earned income tax credit and those that have no credit and no income tax. And like I mentioned, in terms of expanding generosity, there are states that are really digging in on being more generous, more inclusive of their tax credits. So whether it's extending it to younger filers, those without a Social Security number, non-custodial parents, other sorts of groups, you can see that there's quite a bit of variation. And if you have any questions about states that are doing this and want more, we have it both in our roadmap that I'm sure is being put into the chat, but also feel free to reach out to me and we'll help get that information to you. For both Pennsylvania and South Carolina, we worked with them to do a benefit cost analysis so that we could really understand what a tax credit would do in terms of really benefiting both the families and the state. And I'm sure that Phil Falvo will walk you through some of this for Pennsylvania, but we did both a 10% refundable and a 25% refundable. And the benefits relative to the costs are quite substantial. A 7-to-1 for 10% and a 3-to-1 for 25%. And the benefits back to the state are really important and a key talking point that can be used to illustrate why this is a good investment to make. And same with South Carolina, although the benefit to cost ratios are slightly different, we did this for them as well, so that they could make the direct case to lawmakers that by limiting the revenue that comes in, right? So this is tax credits. It will limit the amount of tax revenue that you get. It actually benefits households. It gets people to work. It increases income tax on all earners. And over time, or within 1 year even, you can see the benefits far outweigh the cost. All right, in sake of time, I'm going to go real quickly to the child tax credits. And as many of you remember, the American Rescue Plan Act had a very generous but temporary federal child tax credit. And it led to a huge reduction in child poverty by more than half, and that particularly for children of color. And there is not evidence yet on what a state child tax credit will do, but we have no doubt that it is also a positive thing. The evidence just hasn't been there because, as you can see, in the last several years, states have really been latching on to creating their own child tax credits that are actually quite generous. There's variation all over. This chart is on our website, but I'm not going to go through it all, but you can see in terms of the income level in Maine up to $440,000 a year for married couples, as opposed to only $80,000 a year in Colorado in terms of who's eligible, the age limit for children, the number of children, whether it's eligible to those who don't have a Social Security number. The variation is quite large, and the generosity is also quite large. From a refundable tax credit of $1,750 per child in Minnesota to a non-refundable tax credit of $100 per child in Oklahoma. And here, this chart is a little hard to see, but this is where we're trying to show in that teal color, a lot of states that have an earned income tax credit also have a child tax credit. And when you start to stack those credits on top of each other, at the bottom, you can see the family's level of income, and up the side, you can see the value of the credit. And we're using Oregon in this example, that if they only had one of the credits, then the family would be getting $2,000. But when you add that to the earned income tax credit as well, it can add up to over $500 additional dollars for families in that kind of $20,000 to $25,000 range. So that said, I wanted to just level set as to what we're talking about when we talk about tax credits, the benefits that they have for families, and the ways that states are actually structuring their tax credits. I also want to encourage you to put questions in the chat as we go through, and that we will have time at the end for question and answers. But I'd like to turn now to our panelists, who are really who you're here to hear from, and allow them each a few minutes to be able to talk about what it is that they're doing in their state with regard to the tax credits. So they each have something different going on, whether they're introducing an earned income tax credit for the first time, whether they're considering it, whether they're trying to expand it, child tax credits, et cetera. So they are who you're here for. Phil, can you start us off and tell us what's going on in Pennsylvania with regard to your state's tax credits?
Thanks, Cynthia. So as you mentioned, we were fortunate enough to work with your team on a fiscal impact study for state earned income tax credit. We introduced it now, and we're in our second session where it's been introduced, and I'm happy to say that that bill has passed our House with bipartisan support, and it's sitting in our Senate. Pennsylvania is a unique state because we do have a tax forgiveness program. No other state has anything like this. It benefits the lowest income earners in the Commonwealth. What it is, it's a non-refundable tax credit for individuals who apply for forgiveness at the time when they file their state income tax. It does not compare to the earned income tax credit, where the EITC would benefit those working households that earn more till they reach the top of the scale. The tax forgiveness program has a phase out. The more you earn, the less benefit you receive. So in Pennsylvania, this would really give us a two-pronged attack on poverty here in the Commonwealth. For United Way of Pennsylvania, it makes sense because we follow a data set called ALICE, which stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained Employed, which are families who are living paycheck to paycheck, but struggling to afford basic needs. For us, this makes absolute sense when we talk about that population. As you mentioned, the study was looked at for 10 and 25% earned income tax credits. In the first session, we introduced a bill with a 10% earned income tax credit because Republicans had majorities in both chambers. Unfortunately, that bill did not receive any action. However, this session went to 25% earned income tax credit. As I mentioned, it passed our House actually on June 12th of 23, and now we are waiting on our Senate. We've had discussions with our administration. There is support. Our biggest hurdle is getting it through our Republican-dominated Senate. Recently, I found out that they feel that the discussion around return on investment for any tax credit is moot. And it's honestly because they've been burnt in the past. Our state's independent fiscal office did a 5-year study of tax credits in the state, and they found that tax credits on average were returning between a nickel and 96 cents on the dollar. Whereas your study is showing that for every $1 we invest, we get $3 back with a 25% earning tax credit. So that's really going to lend itself to our strategy moving forward.
Well, thank you, Phil. And we'll talk a little bit more about that strategy, but really appreciate it. And it was really fun to work with you on that project. And Brian, we worked with you as well in South Carolina. Can you tell us what it is that you all in South Carolina are aiming to do with regard to tax credits there?
Yeah, so the EITC story in South Carolina starts, I guess, about 15 years ago with the first introduction of a bill to create a state match of an EITC. And that story was very uneventful for the following 10 years. Huge credit to United Ways worldwide as well, because you all picked up that torch, I guess, at around 2015. And we partnered with them advocating for a refundable EITC. And that refundability became a real sticking point politically for the passage. But the concept of the EITC otherwise was well received. And for those of you who've heard of the multiple streams theory of public policy, that good public policies come around when your problem, the stream of problems meets the stream of solutions at the same time as the stream of politics. The problem is really clear on poverty, and the solutions with the EITC are really potent. Politically, there was a need to finance road infrastructure in the state, and the gas tax that they were proposing was regressive. And in order to address that, the EITC was a solution that fit that at the right time. Now we're working on making those three streams come together for refundability as well. And there's the other framework that I find incredibly useful for public policy is the Shawshank Redemption policy framework, which is that quote from Red in the movie that geology is the study of pressure and time, and that's all it takes really is pressure and time. So that's really where we are on the political side of moving that stream to intercept on the refundability piece. But I'll also say that benefit cost analysis has been really impactful from that. Does the solution actually fit the problem? When you're trying to convince the lawmakers, there are a set of things that those of us on the call who've been working in public policy bang our heads into the wall about, that it's just silly stupid that we're not doing this stuff at a bigger scale because it costs so much less than it saves and it creates great human outcomes. And so why in the world are we doing it more? That's something that we understand about the EITC, but most lawmakers across the country just have not had that kind of experience with the EITC or the study or the studies behind it. And ICS got into this topic because beyond the research, Cynthia, that you noted, it also just $1,000 of extra benefit increases kindergarten readiness. It increases third grade reading and math. It increases eighth grade reading and math and high school graduation and college matriculation, all if the family got it when the little kid was little. And so that sort of policy lever impact is really rare. And so a lot of our challenge now is showing that in hard copy in a persuasive way, and that the benefit cost analysis that the PN-3 Center did with us, that it when you look into the details of the charts, showing things like, hey, this reduces suicides, this reduces substantiated cases of abuse and neglect, and this is what that saves the state. It's able to frame up that it's silly stupid that we're not doing this more already in a compelling fashion.
Thank you, Brian. And as a professor of public policy, I'm going to steal your Shawshank approach when I'm teaching my students. This is wonderful. Thanks for that. And you guys have a lot going on in Michigan. And really some impressive work. Can you talk a little bit more about what your goals are and what you've accomplished and where you're headed?
Yeah, so I think it helps to know a little bit about Michigan's background with the earned income tax credit. We've had an earned income tax credit since 2006. It was originally set at 20% of the federal credit, which is, very robust, on par with kind of what we see in other states. That was cut in 2011 to just 6% of the federal level as a result of a new legislative push to get, $1.6 billion in corporate tax cuts. So it was one of many programs kind of on the chopping block at that time. And honestly, keeping it at 6% even was pretty hard fought. We were really playing defense for a number of years. In 2015, there was another attempt to eliminate the credit altogether. So just kind of biding our time until an opportunity arose, and that seemed to come first in 2019 when our governor, a Democratic governor, proposed doubling the credit to 12% of the federal level. That was part of her budget proposal. It ultimately wasn't adopted. But then in 2021, we had another proposal. A bill was introduced by a Republican senator to increase the credit to 30% of the federal credit, which was huge and obviously a great opportunity, both because it was coming from the Republican side, but there was this obvious kind of bipartisan support for this credit. So around 2021, we started doing a huge amount of advocacy and lobbying around it. We did work with a multi-client lobbyist, which I think really helped us get in the door with a lot of, especially Republican House and senators. We did a lot of one-on-one meetings in addition to showing up to, all of the committee hearings on that bill and the next bill that ultimately was passed. We wanted to speak to Republicans specifically because there were a lot of concerns raised at the time about things like fraud, because there's some reports about fraud at the federal level. They also had a lot of questions about work requirements, not really understanding that there were work requirements. Fortunately, we didn't have to deal so much with the what's this going to cost question because we had this huge budget surplus at the time, and that really helped us kind of push it through. We also did a lot of kind of data sharing. So we created district level fact sheets to share with all of the members of, both in the House and the Senate. We worked with our state treasury to get district level data. How many people, how many families were receiving the EITC? How much is it going to increase? How much of that money is going back to your district? So really trying to frame it around not just this is how much it's going to cost the state, but rather here's how much is going back into your community. So I think that really helped. And then, of course, I think the really big important piece was our partners. We were part of a statewide coalition with over 200 members, and these were some of our traditional sort of anti-poverty partners, groups like the United Ways, social services organizations, but also importantly, faith leaders and business leaders. So on the business side of things, we had the Small Business Association, we had, the Michigan Manufacturers Association, all of the big chambers of commerce across the state were behind this. And I think that really helped garner support from a lot of different angles. So it did ultimately pass last year. It was quintupled to that 30% level, which we were really excited about. I think for most of the time we had been really just pushing to restore it to the 20%. So the fact that 30% was an option was incredible. And it had been a big priority of ours for over a decade now. So pretty immediately we were like, okay, what next? And that's kind of where we are now, is looking at expansion to those who aren't eligible, because we do use the federal criteria. So that means people without a social security number are left out. Some people, because of their age, who are working, are left out. And then, of course, looking also at the child tax credit, just recognizing how much progress has been made on that front and how effective the federal expansion was. So we're trying to really build on some of that success and continue to work with some of these partners who we have gotten to know as part of the EITC coalition.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it, and it's really, really impressive what has happened. I would love to hear you all talk a little bit more about how you have framed the message. I've heard several conservative legislators talk about it as a tax cut for working families. I have heard others, use the phrase working family credit, not an earned income tax credit. I'm just wondering, what is the most successful strategies or messaging that you feel is really resonating? And maybe there's a couple of different messages for different groups that you speak with, but how are you connecting this idea to really make it so that it's something that has bipartisan support? Brian, do you want to start us off on that one?
Sure. So for some political context, South Carolina has double supermajorities of Republican members and a Republican governor. So centrally, we were paying attention to communicating to Republican electeds and their staff. I'll say that the number of times I mentioned Ronald Reagan in a conversation is very, very high. For those of you who don't know, the EITC was first enacted through the Reagan administration and has been expanded in every administration from both parties between Reagan and Obama. And so that's in terms of trying to sort of neutralize the partisanship, this is not a right or a left idea at its core. This is a tax credit that promotes work and helps families, and it's got the stuff for both parties. I will say that we haven't been doing as much in the public comms side of it. So a lot of our conversations were very tailored to the person that we were talking to. And so one of the great things about the EITC, the research behind it is a little like the Bible. It's got something for everybody in it. You can there is a story or an anecdote or a passage that is on point for the person you're talking to. And so I would encourage folks who are engaging in this just to be aware of the sheer amount of ammunition that's available for a particular lawmaker. The other piece that I would recommend to folks is a book by Jonathan Haidt, which is the Political Mind, I think it's called. The subtitle is why the right gets it wrong and the left doesn't get it. I think it talks about the different ways that political frameworks inform how people think of moral policy decisions. And that I think has also been really helpful in the context of the EITC conversation. So I'd say it's largely a lot of talking to folks about the stuff that they want to talk about, and understanding the research and the power of the tool.
Well, thank you for that. Maybe you could put the name of the book in the
yes.
chat if you think about it, and that way others might be able to access it too. It's a great book. Phil, do you want to share what is kind of the core messages that you've been using in Pennsylvania to help kind of make this so successful? Because this past year, you guys had a big win in the House.
We did, and thanks. And I guess I'll do what Brian did and give some political context. So Democrats have a 1-seat majority in our state house. That's their first majority they've had in 14 years. The Senate, there's a fairly significant Republican majority in our Senate, and we have a Democratic governor who's in his second session. Anybody hasn't heard the name Josh Shapiro yet, then you haven't been paying attention to the I-95 bridge fiasco. But the big discussion has been, and the discussion we continue to push, is around all of our data. We learned, especially after the first session, that talking about this in context of politics just wasn't getting us anywhere, because we're a very purple state. Talking about the numbers and making them people-related policies made a significant difference. So we found that on average, had we had an earned income tax credit last year, the average household would get about $1,594, or I'm sorry, $594. It doesn't sound like much, but when you're coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic and you're seeing the impact across the Commonwealth, it's pretty easy to see that households need it. We were also able to tie it into needs-based data for PA-211, so our 3-digit calling line. That has helped us immensely because we are funded through the state and we're able to tie the two together. We see needs over 1 million. We see over 1 million needs a year in terms of calls, texts, and chats. So we're able to tie the two. Those who are calling typically don't qualify for state programs, so they fit into that ALICE demographic, which ironically would be the same demographic that would be targeting an earned income tax credit. So we're able to talk it as in terms of people by the numbers, and not just it's good for insert urban, suburban, rural, because that's always a controversial issue here in Pennsylvania. I will say, and I don't know, remember this is a question, not the challenge we keep running into is, but is your return on investment correct? Is your cost correct? Are we going to get a surprise in year 3 or 4? And it's ironic because we're finding that's not going to be the case at all. We see the uptake rates every year in federal earned income tax credit in Pennsylvania. It is in the 80th, we're mid 80th percentile. We're not seeing that number go up. Even during the pandemic, when there were enhanced earned income tax credit, we didn't see that number go up. So those who are eligible are probably going to be the ones that continue to apply. We're able to tell the story in context of people first, and I think that's really been beneficial to us. Our sticking point is going to be getting it through our Senate that is concerned about 2 very large budgets introduced by our governor that have huge spend numbers. So time will tell if we could show that ROI is legitimate.
Yeah, I appreciate that quite a bit. I know in Montana, they had to they had a big win this past year in the earned income tax credit, and maybe an extra session. But the way that it had to come about was as part of an overall tax package where there were tax reductions on businesses and tax reductions on higher earners. And so this was seen as a tax reduction on lower income earners. But it had to be taken into account for the whole range of folks, not just focused on lower income earners. And what about in Michigan? What are some of the core messages? You shared a few, and really wanted to just reiterate how important that community level data or district level data must be. But what are some of the core messages that you have found that have been successful in Michigan?
Yeah, so I would say, like Ryan and Phil, we definitely talked a lot about the history, the fact that it is bipartisan. Michigan is also a very purple state. Although it was ultimately a Democratic majority that pushed this through, the fact is, I think had had it not been that way, I still think there was enough momentum behind it. So yeah, during our meetings with lawmakers, we were definitely talking about Ford and Reagan, and I had a lot more conversations about Milton Friedman's negative income tax than I would have predicted, but it was definitely
Yes.
something that a lot of lawmakers are familiar with and could definitely understand the reasoning behind it. And then I would say from our end, we kind of struggle a little bit with talking too much about having work requirements. And I do think that that has been one of our struggles with the child tax credit now, but definitely talking about working families. They did ultimately rename it the Working Families Tax Credit in Michigan. And also really focusing on that return to local economies. So cutting out all the talk about how much it costs and really focusing on this is money that's getting spent like by families, by people who know how they need to spend it. That really resonated with a lot of our legislators.
Yeah, that last point that you made, I think, is so important. You know, one of the key assumptions that we make in our benefit cost analysis is on the fact that families with lower levels of income spend every dime on necessities, and it goes to the community. Like you said, they're buying food, they're buying clothing, they are paying bills. You know, this is not just going to squirrel away in someone's bank account forever. Which Phil, please come in here on that.
One other thing I was going to jump in, it doesn't just cover basic needs, but those throughout the year expenses that tend to get pushed off for households that are struggling, like repairing the car, home repairs, you know, any kind of technological upgrades the house needs. I mean, I think you really highlighted that well in our report. These are not funds that go into a savings or checking account. And we had to make that point time and again with our legislature. There's no one that's going to take their earned income tax credit and say, well, I'll put this in the savings for next year. As fast as that's coming in, it's out the door. And sometimes it's already earmarked for an expense because the family's counting on receiving that.
Yep. And they're able to use those one-time expenses to keep them in their house or to pay off the bill so that they are to, like you said, fix their car so they can keep their job. And they're therefore not having to be as reliant on other sorts of government programs. And so part of the return on the investment or the benefits is a reduction in spending on other sorts of programs. Brian?
That reminds me of something that I should have said at the outset. And your job title is so on point for this, the family voice piece. There is nothing as powerful as having someone come in and talk about how the EITC helped them repair their carburetor so that they could keep their job. Full stop. Like that's the ball game for a lot of folks, and it's I think that has been it's a lot harder to advocate for this if the beneficiaries in the minds of the legislator are created out of thin air. If they've talked to a mom who's trying to make these ends meet, that's so much more powerful.
Yeah. So having that kind of head and heart balance, because there isn't a program, as Phil said, you know, you're talking about it's the largest anti-poverty program. It's also the largest studied policy program that we have, because to Brian, your point, you know, it's been around. Ford actually started it as a temporary one. And,
right.
So it's been around for so long, we can actually measure the benefit, but so have families felt the benefits. And so you have these important stories from both. Before we open up for questions, I have kind of two other, or maybe one point. The American Rescue Plan Act had a substantial child tax credit that was paid monthly for 6 months. And then the rest of it was paid in a one-time payment. And it led to substantial reductions in child poverty, particularly children of color. It didn't, the research shows it did not have a negative impact on employment. And you say that you're going after the child tax credit, but Phil and Brian, I haven't heard that Pennsylvania or South Carolina is considering that. Can you talk about the differences? And you started to touch on it with the working family piece. How is it perceived? Because there's a lot of bipartisan support for a child tax credit at the federal level. Is that transcending down to the states? Do you think that there's momentum in a child tax credit coming?
Well, so in Michigan, there's definitely, we've seen bipartisan support for child tax credit. We've seen a bill introduced, I believe by a Republican congressman, that would link it to the federal credit. So some percent of whatever your federal child tax credit, which I believe maybe Wisconsin also has proposed something similar. We've also, a lot of our former EITC partners who are part of that big coalition have been talking about a working parents tax credit. So that would be focused on children under 6, but again, would have a work requirement. So I think that's the piece that's been really difficult for us, is that we don't want it to be tied to any sort of work requirement. We know that, 1 in 4 kids is left out of the full federal credit because their parents earn too little. So really trying to shift the narrative that, this is, children have needs regardless of their parents' working status or the amount that they're bringing home. Has definitely been kind of a language shift, and it's something that we've had to raise a lot with our existing partners who didn't necessarily understand that that was one of the big differences between the child tax credit and the EITC.
Yes, yeah. What about Phil and Brian? How about, is there any appetite for a child tax credit, and how is it perceived differently?
So Pennsylvania, we're an intriguing state. We just enacted a child dependent care tax credit 2 years ago, and it was 25% of the federal tax credit.
Mm-hmm.
This past summer, it was increased to 100%. So it's a match and it's refundable, unlike the federal tax credit. So you have households with children with childcare expenditures getting something back. The problem is it was painted as a solution to the childcare staffing problem here in Pennsylvania. That couldn't be farther from the truth.
Right.
To me, the child dependent care tax credit has always been the secondary tax credit. The child care tax credit just yields better benefits, but there's always that cost. The discussion really hasn't trickled down that here to Pennsylvania yet. We've talked about earned income tax credit and child tax credit hand in hand with some of our partners. So I know Ann mentioned she was part of a coalition. We built our own as well. It's not as big as hers. We're only 28 partners, and we're very diverse. So we have business partners, we have education partners, we have workforce development partners, and we talk about how these tax credits benefit across the spectrum. For us, a child tax credit would make sense, but like Brian said, there has to be the political will. And in our state, it's like the immovable object and the unstoppable force, and they just butt heads on June 29th at 11 p.m. going into June 30th, and they don't typically get a deal done. And I don't know if there's the will there yet to finish this.
Yeah. Brian, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'd say that the looking at the political will lens in South Carolina, there is a lot of interest in employment, and there's a lot of interest in childcare, and there's not as much political energy around reducing poverty. I think that's just the nature of the landscape at this point. And so I think while child tax credit, I agree that the benefits are astoundingly positive, and it's hard to argue against lifting kids out of poverty. But at the same time, I think from the political window perspective, things like the Louisiana child tax credit suite, or child care tax credit suite, and that's, for those of you who haven't run into that, it provides credits for supporting child care costs, both to families and employers and staff members of child care centers and to the centers themselves. So things like that suite are getting a lot of interest in the child care discussion, because there is a lot of political resonance to tax credits. It's just the challenge of tying it to child care is probably going to be the most the most viable at this moment in time. But that said, again, when you have a solution in the offing, the windows shift over time. And so
Right.
Shawshank applies to this.
Bill.
I think something that's interesting too is we hear this large discussion across the country about workforce development and economic investment, right? So I'm in Pennsylvania, probably a quickly aging state that is in dire need of a young workforce. Our governor released a economic impact report and his economic plan for our state for the next 20 years, but it left out the most important part. Where's the workforce going to come? We have a 3.7% unemployment rate. The purpose of some of these the point behind some of these tax credits is it makes us competitive with our neighbors. Every state around us except for West Virginia has an earned income tax credit. We're already down on that. If we have states around us that have implemented or are looking at a child tax credit, we don't have that. To make Pennsylvania truly attractive to those who could move here for what is a very beautiful state and has great opportunities, we have to offer an incentive. We're just not doing that. We're willing to do that for businesses to attract high-paying jobs. We're not attracting the skilled workforce we need. And these tax credits are really that difference.
Yeah. Yeah. And they can make it such a huge difference. I mean, having children, unfortunately, we have our children at the age in which we are the healthiest to have them, but the kind of most early in our career, we're not as big earners, and they're incredibly expensive. I mean, just thinking of the child tax credit as a way to help pay for diapers, it would be, it's so expensive to have little ones. And so that sort of incentive would make a big difference. And did you want to add anything else to that part of the conversation?
Well, I do think that we're in a similar boat. It sounds like to Pennsylvania in terms of we did have a really useful population growth report come out, I believe in August of last year, that showed that by 2040, Michigan is going to have more deaths than births, and it's not being made up for by internal migration, either domestic or international, and that's a huge concern. And so, yeah, kind of trying to use that to reshape the thinking around, do we need to be giving subsidies to corporations, or do we need to be incentivizing people to want to come live here? You know, how are we going to encourage young Michiganders to stay or to come back? And how are we going to encourage immigrants to pick Michigan as a destination? So I think that population report really speaks to the need for some of these programs, especially for you know, young and low income workers.
Yeah, well, I want to, looking at the clock, invite the participants on this call to ask questions, or even to just share with us what your state is trying to do and where you are, and maybe there's some areas that you have found success with or wanted to share that. But I would love it if any of you want to just take yourself off mute and ask a question. And if not, I have a couple more questions for our panelists, but I'm going to pause here for a second.
Cynthia, it looks like one went into the chat.
Oh, great. So Phil, are there specific policy levers that are holding legislators back to getting the deal done? So I'm assuming that we're talking about whether it's refundability or the generosity or the eligibility. Are there any of those in which you find are the sticky points?
So interestingly enough, I actually had someone on the Republican side ask me about making it non-refundable, and we just can't support that. A non-refundable tax credit really defeats the purpose and the benefits. It really eviscerates the benefits. When we first introduced the bill, it was refundable. It was only a 10% earned income tax credit, so much lower benefits. And the bill never went anywhere. It had no support from the Democratic side. We were told time and again they loved the concept, but the benefits weren't there. Now we increased the benefits, and we saw a bipartisan vote in the House. We did flip some urban and suburban Republicans to vote for the bill. Then we got to the Senate, and I wish it was a political lever. It's been more like a political brick wall. Cost comes up time and again. There's always that emphasis on what's it going to cost in year one, not so much that ROI. And I think that really has been exacerbated on those tax credit studies I mentioned, because we just saw multiple tax credits get eviscerated by our independent fiscal office. And I think there's a fear that if tax dollars continue to get invested in tax credits that don't yield the expected results, that our legislators are going to have to answer for that.
Yeah.
Now, I will point that all of those tax credits are for businesses, and they are for certain business sectors. They don't benefit individuals in any way. And this is really the first time, other than our child dependent care tax credit and our tax forgiveness program, we'd be looking at something to benefit individual working households.
Yeah. It's so interesting that you mentioned that, because, you know, here in Nashville, we're giving all sorts of incentives, direct incentives and credits so that we can build a big old stadium, or so that, you know, Oracle can come in and have all the land that it needs and not have to pay taxes on lots of things. I know this is being recorded, so, you know, I'm not saying negative things about that so much, but the research is really, really clear that stadiums do not have any return on investment. You know, all these big investments end up, Brian's laughing, but it's true. We teach this in Public Policy 101, right? But when you invest in families with low levels of income who are going to spend those dollars in the community, that is going to get the money back to you right away. And so it's a very different thing of comparing those sorts of tax credits. And so I'm glad you brought up that point. But Brian, I don't know if you wanted to just laugh out loud or if you wanted to add.
I'm trying not to interrupt too much with court jester style feedback, but yes, that's I laugh in part because even when you're talking about not stadiums, the state of South Carolina just invested over $1 billion in a battery factory for electric cars through Scout Motors. And the challenge that I have with that is that's enough to fully fund childcare, full stop.
Mhm.
And the impact that you're describing from the EITC, it would be very, very similar if you just remove that burden from young families, that financial burden. The benefits would be astounding. And so it's often a brick wall that I feel like banging my head against the trade-offs that we make.
Yeah.
Sometimes frustrating.
And going back, Anne, to your point at the very beginning, when you do these statewide tax credits, the benefits are felt in every district, not just in that one district that got that new plant or got that new stadium. So I see Michelle coming back on, which tells me that she's probably going to wrap us up. But I just wanted to make sure if anyone has kind of 30 seconds or whatever, if there's any final words of wisdom to give to any of these folks who are going down your path.
All it takes is pressure and time.
Shawshank, okay. Bill.
I tie earned income tax credit into your issues of the day. If it's economic development, remind them that economic development doesn't happen without people and investment.
Anne?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think actually the president says it really well when he says that the budget is a reflection of your values. So if you value children, families, workers, invest in them.
Thank you for that. Michelle, thank you for the opportunity for us to have this conversation today. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to talk really fast because we have 60 seconds. Here is the presenter, the panelist contact information. I'm sure they would love to continue the conversation with you. If you have questions, there will be a place in the evaluation for you to tell us if you have additional questions, and you should feel free to put that in there. I also invite you, if you are not already, to join the Prenatal-to-3 XChange today. If you're not a part, it's a great community of experts and people just like you asking questions, sharing ideas, trying to make the world a better place for the prenatal to 3 folks. So thank you very much. It's now 3 o'clock. I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for spending a bit of your day with us, and we'll see you next time.